Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're taking a deep dive into a profoundly resonant, slightly dark, but ultimately beautifully liberating psychological fable, the story of the Wanderer and the Living Ink. Think of me as your mentor as we navigate this one together. We're going to be exploring the freezing depths of rigid intellectual isolation, and then seeing exactly what it takes to break out of that into chaotic liberation. It's all about the structures we build inside our own minds. Let's jump right in. Have you ever built a prison out of your own need to just be perfect? Have you ever trapped yourself in a quest for total, absolute certainty? Now, that's not just a rhetorical question for us to ponder. It actually perfectly mirrors the tragic initial state of our protagonist here, the Wanderer. See, he was a guy who wanted nothing more than to be absolutely, unconditionally free. But as we're about to see, that exact desire became his cage. So the Wanderer's descent starts off, frankly, pretty violently. He takes this heavy iron hammer of genealogy and absolutely shatters what the story calls the stained glass cathedrals of his ancestors. He is completely done with the old world. He scrubs the holy water from his brow and marches straight into the freezing, biting winds of the Sils Maria uplands. But here's where he makes a massive, critical error. His merciless intellect still craves structure. So, almost inadvertently, he takes the broken debris of those old discarded idols and uses them to construct a brand new internal prison, a terrifying place of calcified order known as the Infinite Dungeon. It's a really tragic irony, right? His intended goal was absolute freedom. He fled what he called the city of the pious because he wanted a totally clean slate. But the actual result? It was the exact opposite. By demanding absolute certainty and complete intellectual control over his reality, he just created an environment of total intellectual isolation. He was completely trapped in a loop of his own making, a prisoner of his own forced order. And then, alone on those frost-bitten crags, the horrific realization really sets in. His own shadow actually detaches itself and delivers this incredibly chilling line. "You have merely made the dungeon infinite." The Wanderer had become entirely stiff, breathless. He was living in absolute terror that a single wrong step or a single spontaneous thought would completely shatter his fragile internal order. He definitely wasn't free. He was just the warden, in a prison that happened to have no visible walls. Okay, part 2, the catalyst of chaos, focusing on the mercurial awakening. Because when a system gets dangerously rigid, unpredictable life always finds a way to force its way in. This brings us to a pivotal event called the Mercurial Awakening. In the Wanderer's mind, there are these entities known as the three siblings of the spill. Now, originally, they were just mischievous little imps, minor annoyances, really. But as his mental world calcifies, they undergo this wild, chaotic transformation into beast-like harbingers of chaos. And the really crucial takeaway here is that they are not the villains of the story. They emerge as the necessary medicine. They act like a psychological immune response, stepping in to rupture that dungeon before the tension causes his reality to snap entirely. Now, what actually triggered this awakening? It was a transformative substance called the ink of negation. And it's super important to understand how to view this ink. You hear the word negation, and your first instinct is probably to think of it as some sort of destructive poison. But in the context of the Wanderer's completely frozen, calcified state, it is the exact cure he requires. It negates the stagnation. It acts as this volatile, transformative agent that gives the siblings the power they need to do their necessary destructive work on his internal prison. So the three siblings launch a perfectly coordinated three-pronged intervention to dismantle the Wanderer's trap. You've got the wit, who targets his intellectual ego. You have the hunger, targeting his isolation. And finally, the small, targeting his rigid gait. Each sibling plays a highly specific role in tearing down these walls. Let's break down exactly how they pulled this off, starting with the wit. The wit is completely all about unmasking. The wit steps right up and uses cynical laughter and a distorting mirror against him. Remember that incredibly heavy stone mask of intellectual authority the Wanderer liked to wear? Well, the wit's mirror reveals it to be nothing more than cheap papier-mâché. It initiates the total collapse of his intellectual ego simply by exposing the very human, trembling hands hiding right behind that mask. By pulling off this unmasking, the wit transforms the gloomy, gothic dusk of the Wanderer's mind into what's described as a heap of delightful absurdity. All of that heavy weight from the discarded idols, all that profound seriousness he used to punish himself with, it's shattered. And not by another heavy hammer, but just by cynical laughter. It proves that you simply cannot maintain an infinite dungeon when you're laughing at how absurdly cheap its walls actually are. Next up, we have the hunger. If the wit dismantled the ego, the hunger completely dismantles the environment. The hunger acts as a literal void in the logic. It inhales the precise equations of isolation, consuming the very threads of order that the wanderer used to map out his prison. Where the wanderer demanded absolute certainty, the hunger just eats the math. The result of the hunger's feast is the total liquefaction of the dungeon. It is a messy, visceral, sensory destruction. The solid walls don't just crack, they melt into a wet, black slurry. His rigid expectations get swallowed whole. And that terrifying dead silence of isolation, it's replaced by this buzzing cacophony of how did this happen? The hunger basically ensures that the wanderer's mental landscape can never ever set into permanent stone again. And finally, we reach the third sibling, the small. Now, the dungeon is liquefied, the ego is cracked open, but the wanderer himself is still physically and mentally frozen stiff. The small brings the unbinding of whim by introducing artful mistakes into the equation. This is the exact intervention needed to break the infinite loop of the shadow's taunting voice, which had kept him completely paralyzed in fear. So how does the small actually accomplish this? Well, through tiny, unpredictable disruptions. Think a spilled lamp or a slight hiccup in the rhythm of the mountain. They seem like minor things, sure, but to a man terrified of making a single wrong step, they force a reaction. They force the wanderer out of his rigid gait. As the fable describes it, these little mistakes act like a breeze that reminds a stiff world how to dance. It forces those calcified bones to move and pushes the narrative forward. Which leads us to our final section, the punchline of existence. We're looking at the ultimate evolution, from a state of total restriction to pure liberation. At the very core of this whole transition is a massive shift in his psychological tools. Think about it. In the beginning, he wielded that iron hammer of genealogy, a heavy, rigid tool that was really only good for breaking things down. But post-awakening, after the siblings have done their work, that hammer melts into a wooden jester's wand. It's flexible, it's creative, it perfectly represents the power of unscripted whim rather than dogmatic destructive force. And as his tools change, the internal landscape undergoes this stunning metamorphosis. Visually, it's a complete rebuild. First, that glaring, interrogating sun of absolute certainty just vanishes. Second, that heavy, taunting shadow that followed him everywhere, it transforms into a soft velvet floor. And finally, the claustrophobic, infinite dungeon completely collapses into an open, empty amphitheater. He literally built a grand stage right out of the ruins of his former prison. The overarching takeaway here is how his actual narrative shifts. He spent so long living this tragedy of forced order, basically just waiting around for reality to punish him. He felt like he was living under a decree of execution. But thanks to the siblings, that decree of execution was magically changed into a decree of desert. He realizes he doesn't have to control every single variable. He has become the star of a grand, unscripted comedy, totally ready to embrace messy, joyous improvisation. And that brings us to his ultimate liberation, represented by the damp page and the wet ink. See, because the ink of his life remains wet, his story is no longer some static gray blueprint. He isn't bound by the stained glass cathedrals of his ancestors anymore, and he definitely isn't bound by his own merciless intellect either. He's become a living, changing narrative. He is finally free to write the next line of his existence without all that fear. So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to turn this back to you. What next line of your own existence are you too terrified to write right now, simply because you refuse to let go of your own absolute certainty? We all build infinite dungeons out of our desire for control, don't we? Maybe it's time to invite in a little bit of cynical laughter, allow for a few artful mistakes, and finally embrace the messy, unscripted comedy of your own life. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.